All right, welcome to another edition of New Wine Uncorked. As always, I'm Matt Farlow, and to my left and below are Tony and Phil, and we're stoked again to join you. For all those who have been watching, again, on our YouTube page, this is where you find it. Be sure to go below or next to Phil and hit that subscribe button. Hit the logo for New Wine and subscribe to our YouTube page so that anytime we have videos that are uploaded, whether it's from New Wine Uncorked, New Wine Tastings, or New Wine Table Talks, that you will be informed. And then also head on over to our Facebook page, New Wine Skins. And then that way also you can be updated and hear what's going on with New Wine, and that you can become a part of the community. It's why Tony, it's why Phil and myself were stoked to continue to participate at Multnomah, was because of what New Wine was doing. New Wine has an intentional desire to engage culture, building bridges, relational bridges through Jesus. Last week, the three of us were talking about homo consumus and this idea of the human as being a consumer. We live in a consumeristic society. And so it's probably 70 days now or something, we're going to be voting for a new president. Evangelicals are right there in the mix of this voting. And so today we want to talk about and continue this dialogue. If we're consuming, what are we consuming? And then how does that play into faith? And what does that look like? We have two different perspectives of America playing out. Last week, if anyone watched the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, there was a portrayal of America. This week, we're seeing a different portrayal. And so my question to each one of us, and I don't know if either of you saw this, but Franklin Graham tweeted out in relation to the DNC saying that there is no God. And he was claiming that the DNC took out One Nation Under God from their writings, which they didn't. It just wasn't highlighted. And so I'm wondering, like, how is the Christian, do you think? I know people always talk about this is when politics come up, people shy away and say, oh my gosh, we shouldn't have these talks. You know, we shouldn't have preachers shouldn't be preaching from the pulpit about who to vote for. How is it that the Christian should stay informed? And what should the Christian do in today's very tumultuous political, atmosphere? So how is it that we safeguard our Christianity or who we are, our faith, and live it out in today's culture? And what are some of the ways in which you've seen people doing this rightly or wrongly? We talked last week about the worship event from Bethel. Is this the way? So how is it that we go about being faithful to God's sovereignty, but then also recognizing free will? And so I don't know if either of you have had a chance to just think about it, but this idea of consumerism, and how does it continue to play out in our faith? And does it impact the church positively or negatively? And in light of especially politics and COVID-19, how should we move forward in faith in today's culture?
Man, one of the first thoughts that come to mind when I think of that is just simply the fact that we can't just continue doing what was done before. I mean, that's key at this moment in time right now. But there's just simply understanding where, if you even want to talk with political lines, where has the church been when it comes to political lines, or particular portions of the church? Where have you been with political lines? We can't sit there and just go with those, because no from the left or from the right aren't gonna consume Jesus. At the same token, our hearts should be consumed by Jesus, and understanding where, and at least having a perspective to say, this is where Jesus would be at this particular moment. Trying to stay faithful to the text, trying to stay faithful to what we know from our God, and trying to follow his example should be the thing that drives us in the middle of this. And that's really probably going to make both left and right mad at us all the time. And I think maybe that's the thing we should be looking for. If no one likes us, then we're actually going where we should be going. So that's what my first thoughts.
Yeah, I think in me trying to just learn how to pastor appropriately during this time, season, and moment, I've gone back to a great theologian, Walter Brueggemann, and so I started diving back into his a seminal text, The Prophetic Imagination. And man, I read this, I think, in like 2012, 2013, and it rings even more true today. And so he encourages pastors and ministry leaders to be faithful to the freedom of God, that God does what God wants and God does not stand on the sidelines. And so he addresses the consumerism that the American church has found itself captive to, if not married to. And so he opens up his book, The Prophetic Imagination, by introducing us to Moses and the Israelite narrative in captivity in Egypt, and he likens this typology of state religion and how the god or the gods of Egypt can afford to be bipartisan. They can afford to discourage polemic conversation because they could care less, because they're in power and they're comfortable. And so the people that subscribe to state religion, the Egyptians, they move in terms of productivity and consumerism. And so he cracks open Exodus and shows how, man, the Israelites were placed under heavy burdens and straw was taken away from them as they were building bricks. And so there's this machine and system of production that the Egyptians consume from the Israelites' work. And I think it situates us perfectly for the pastoral work and the theological work before us in the American evangelical context. If I'm to be frank, I really believe that evangelicalism is the state religion. There are theologians who have coined the term court evangelicals. Evangelical leaders who espouse a certain type of theology, but then will compromise on their convictions or their theological beliefs for the sake of power. So, I mean, we see this with Jerry Falwell Jr., somebody who is outspokenly homophobic, who is, some people would dub him as a protector of purity culture. But then just within this last week, it's unfolded the scandalous nature of his relationship with his wife and a former business associate. So you see these evangelicals who tout moral standards, but it's so hypocritical because they compromise it in their own personal lives and in their support of Donald Trump, who this isn't to condemn Donald Trump. This is to say, man, we need to be consistent with our standards. And so when we talk about a culture of consumerism that the church has, the American church at least, has found itself so embedded into, I think it's the consumption of power and privilege. We've grown fat on just privilege and being able to have religious liberties and religious goods, and we've grown fat on that. And I think that leads us to seeing why evangelicals and evangelicalism can say, man, I don't want to deal with politics. You know, God isn't a political God. The gospel isn't political. But according to Walter Brueggemann in his text, The Prophetic Imagination, God does choose a side because God is free to choose a side. And he chooses the side of the downtrodden and the oppressed and the marginalized. And when we say that we have the ability to not be political, we are choosing the side of the oppressor. And that's strong language, but I think that's what the biblical text bears on us. And I think that's what the witness of the gospel bears on us, and it's my desire to be faithful to that.
Yeah. Phil, you go.
Yeah, Tony, I want to follow up with you on a couple of things. So first, the paradigm you began with just talking about the difference between God being able to do what he wants and God being able to pick a side. Couldn't many of our evangelical brothers and sisters say that they're doing that now? Now, I understood where you took it in talking about how God's secure in his own power and in his own sovereignty and being able to choose the side of the oppressed. And that's where he's able to line. But couldn't our same evangelical brothers and sisters say, well, we want to go to church to worship God. This is what we want to do. And if God was here, he would support, if God was here, excuse me, if Jesus was here, he would support us in the ability to, to go to church and worship in this particular way. And this is how we demonstrate God's sovereignty by being able to go and worship. So couldn't you then take that same idea and apply it to what we see going on here?
Yeah, I think you could, but then it would just, to be frank, be a misappropriation of scripture, a gross misinterpretation, because God never endorses selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
God never endorses egotism. That's why religious liberty is not a Christian category. It's a privileged category. Our faith is never to put others at risk or at harm. Our faith is never to disadvantage or inconvenience other people. We are supposed to be inconvenienced to death, to the cross. And so when Christians begin to have their faith become integrated with the language of religious liberty, I think that's where it's problematic, because religious liberty is neither a Christian category or a biblical category. It's a theological category. We can trace it in its historical development. And I think that's where evangelicals and evangelicalism is held captive in its consumerism. It's because it points to religious liberty, not Christian fidelity. Like, I just, what faith are we proclaiming or holding to? When John MacArthur says, if you don't vote for Trump, you're not a Christian, man, so much for sola fide, so much for sola Christus, so much for all of the solas that he espouses. So it's all the reformers and sola Trumpists. Like, is that what it is? And so, I don't buy the I'm going to show God's sovereignty by gathering together without mass, because then we'll push it to its further extent then and say, give up your guns then. Because if God is totally sovereign to protect you from COVID, God will be totally sovereign to protect you with your firearms. I don't think there's consistency in the metrics and in the interpretation. I think the church, when we look at early movements of healthcare and medicine, the church has always been at the forefront of putting itself at risk for the sake of others. When the plague and the Black Death took place, Christians and priests were the first to go into those cities to care for the dying and the abandoned. I think when we look at evangelicals today, they're the first to do the opposite of that. And so I totally hear where you're coming from, Phil, on that. I don't think religious liberty is a Christian category.
Well, it's interesting that religious liberty was started. I mean, the concept of it was actually begun with Falwell's dad. Back, he died, I think 2000, I was 7, I can't remember, but the senior Falwell was prominent in the push for the religious right, in this religious liberties. And so there is a tension there, though, like, because I appreciate how Phil's pushing back a little bit, because God's sovereignty, how does that not relate to then the human sovereignty, right? In the sense of we are sovereign over ourselves. And if God is in control and he's calling us into, based on your point, Tony. It was the church that went in to take care of the plague, the first, and put themselves at risk. Even though he was a Seventh-day Adventist, but that movie, the Heartbreak Ridge, or the one with the soldier who goes in,
Hacksaw Ridge, yeah.
Hacksaw Ridge, right? The idea is he didn't say no to participate in the military. What he said was, I will participate, but I will do it based on my convictions, right? So in light of what, like Phil was saying, the Christian can easily manipulate scripture to say that this is God's sovereignty, so we should be doing this, i.e. Bethel doing the little worship things with Sean going out there. Maybe he is prophetic. Maybe he is called by the Spirit, and there's an anointing on him, and he's gathering these folks up, and then they are legitimately breathing in the Spirit and breathing out the COVID. I don't know. I don't know the guy. It seems like that's a commandeering, though, of the scripture, and so to take your point, Phil, I think, yeah, the problem is that too many people from Christian standpoint, they do exactly what Tony was claiming that Broom and St. God can do, is to choose, right? Colin Gunton in the One, the Three, and the Many, in his book, he writes that each culture has an unnamed deity, right? We all have an unnamed deity. And the problem I see in today's culture is, for the Christian church, the evangelical Christian church, is that unnamed deity is either power, or prestige. This idea that it's taking Nietzsche's, will to power, and flipping it around and saying we have the power to will ourselves to do it. So it's become very humanistic in the sense that no longer is the Spirit guiding the church, but it's the church who's telling the Spirit, this is the way in which we want to go. We're not out first. Like, look at what you're doing. I mean, how many churches are jumping up, Phil, and jumping into going and helping the homeless, and this is what I find interesting. We just started classes today for the university I teach at, or yesterday. It's quite interesting to see when the religious liberty comes about of demanding, well, fine, we'll wear masks or whatever, but they'll be pulled down, or, social distancing, not so much. Remember, and the reminder that God's in control. But then when it comes to going and helping the local missions, the Portland rescue mission, or seeking the homeless, the concept comes up, and I hear this all the time. We need to be safe. We need to be mindful of our safety and our social distancing and everything. It's like, but where's God's sovereignty? Like with the gun control, where's God's sovereignty in that as well? If I go to a leper colony, shouldn't I have just as much faith that God's gonna take care of me there as he did at my worship event with Sean in Bethel,
Yeah. And I think even the notion that Tony brought up in this follow-up there, just the idea that the church rushes first on behalf of the other, that is definitely something that, yeah, we're just very hesitant to do in general, because we want to preserve ourselves in some regard. But then when it comes to, okay, I'm going to stand up to do what I want on behalf of doing what I want, then I can jump out there. And so that kind of really answers a lot of questions as to what we should be doing. If the thing is to go out and help those who cannot help themselves, that's where we want to believe that where Jesus would be. And this is where we want to rush to. And that's what would lead you to be on the front lines of a protest in the middle of all of this, because you're like, hey, I'm bringing attention to the least of these. I'm bringing attention to those who have been marginalized for years. And I'm actually trying to underscore and promote their existence, and those kind of things. And that being, thinking of how we're gathering now, and the fact that we are limited in being able to gather, but we could gather to help those who have been locked out. We could have been gathered because, most of our shelters right now I don't even know if they offer beds right now in the middle of the phase that we're in as we're going back, trying to get back to normal and the like. But yeah, figuring out how to grant support in that regard. Now, at the same token, I know there are several churches who have been giving, our dear sister Trudy, I always want to bring her up, in their church in Tigard, where they pretty much at the beginning of COVID, man, turned their entire sanctuary into a food bank, when this began. There are churches that are doing that. It's just that that mainstream more vocal evangelical voice has been the one that's saying, oh, we're going to worship, defy the government kind of thing. We're like, what are you talking about? You want to do this on your behalf, not on behalf to help anybody. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, what has been so encouraging in I think just my uh, walk with God and in my uh, submitting myself to other pastors and leaders is the attention that's being paid to Black pastors. More and more, I'm seeing Black pastors step out and no longer submit to white evangelicalism. Black pastors, more and more, at least the younger generation of Black pastors, are leaning into their Black community and their Black heritage and leading the way for the American church. And so as an Asian pastor, I feel so fortunate and blessed to be able to follow Black brothers and sisters in their apostolic leadership. I think there's something to be said about us moving away from a mentality of consuming to the dialectic of Jesus, of giving ourselves up to be consumed. And so, yeah, following the lead of Black pastors has been such a great gift to me. In light of COVID, I think we hear this Christian language all the time of like a revival or a renewal, and that's been co-opted by evangelicalism. But I really think there is a revival and renewal. It's just not in evangelicalism. It's in everywhere outside of evangelicalism. When I look at the authority and the faithfulness of Black brothers and sisters, when I look at the emerging younger leaders who are from colored communities, I see a vibrant Christian leadership for this nation. But it's just not sexy. It's not from the platform. It really is boots on the ground and dirty hands. But that gives me so much hope for the future of the American church. I mean, some people feel like some evangelical leaders keep saying this election will decide the faith of this country. And I was like, I thought last election was going to decide the faith of this country. Like, and I failed my faith test last election. So you're telling me my faith test is this election? Which election is it? Because I feel like it's every 4 years. But looking at the diversity of leadership that's coming up and who that has been present in the United States, I'm so encouraged by God's faithfulness, and then I'm so encouraged by the perseverance of these faithful leaders. And so I don't think Christianity is dying in the United States. I think a particular type or strain of Christianity is, but we'll see.
Absolutely. And Tony, and let me say this while we're here though too, man, you're a part of that as well. You know, definitely as, you know, our younger leaders of color that are coming up within the church, pastoring, teaching in colleges and the like. Sorry, Matt, this ain't you, but at the same token, you're one being a part of the work with New Wine and just your history, Matt, in particular, of talking about this and keeping this a part of the conversation on a regular basis demonstrates that you're a part of the same movement that Tony is just referred to. Now, with that being said, I definitely do believe that this has become a special time because the same way when we look back at the 60s and 70s and we'll see the number of leaders that were birthed and kind of introduced to the world during the midst of what could seem perceived to be as chaos in the middle of that time, we see so many leaders that have come out. We're going to say the same thing about this time as well, when we look back 40, 50 years. So this is definitely a special time. But at the same time, there's a lot of, and I can talk about African American leaders specifically, where there is a disconnect that comes generationally, that has happened generationally. And I imagine, Tony, you'd be able to attest this happening, in your race as well, where you'll see a difference. You'll see just a separation that happens when it comes amongst generations. And there has been problems that definitely need to be addressed as we continue to go forward, because we'll find ourselves repeating the same mistakes that generation and 2 generations or so behind us have done as well. So I concur definitely that this is a moment that the church has demonstrated that the church isn't dead, that God is still active, the Holy Spirit is still moving and still calling men and women to speak his word. And so, yeah, we definitely have to lean into that and continue to develop that, but understand that there is still some history that we have to patch up and that we're going to have to address in order for us not to repeat the same mistakes in a few generations.
No, and Phil, no, thank you for saying that and bringing that up, because I mean, lest people accuse me of only dunking on white evangelicals, like, man, I'm gonna own the anti-black racism in the Asian community, and I would be the first one to confess of the anti-black rhetoric within the Vietnamese community. Talk about racism and cultural systemic racism. The Vietnamese community in the United States is steeped in that. And so for me as a young guy, man, I am just oftentimes left feeling so hopeless and in so much despair, because I look to one side and I'm like, man, there's nothing there, and I look to the other side, I'm like, oh, there's nothing there either, and I'm left floored. But yeah, I mean, what brings me so much joy and courage and it's just being in spaces like this, having these conversations, and then also knowing that there are so many faithful brothers and sisters who are putting their hands to the plow and they have no recognition, but they're a testimony to God's faithfulness and the perseverance of the church. And so but man, there's so much work to do in the evangelical community and in the Asian community.
I think, I mean, I know why you didn't include me, because while Tony can point to, racism and stuff within Asian culture, at least it doesn't happen in the white culture. The white people, I watch this stuff, and I appreciate the fact that the dialogue is happening, or maybe I do think that there's something generational here, because if you watched last night with the Republican National Convention, the folks, any of the couple of black dudes that I saw talking were older, and the athletes that they got, that they were older, and I feel as though the younger generations, and this is where I think that the church is missing out, because when it's calling the mandate to go and make disciples, baptizing, that's a call for generational regeneration, in the sense of the generations always interacting with one another. And yet what we found in the evangelical church is these couple of dudes, and they tend to be white guys, get this power, and then that's, again, they have the power to will what the church becomes, and so then it factors down. And I think this idea, it just so baffles me when I hear white evangelicals talk about like some sort of disgust as to, are we talking about racism again? Go back, and I was having this dialogue in the class that I was teaching today. I was trying to reiterate to the students, we have this mandate to love. Okay, well, love acknowledges the wrongdoings that have happened. And so if you don't see how in the early 1900s and that the educational system was raising up a culture, a generation of people in the late 1800s and early 1900s and beyond, my parents' generation and my grandparents, to think this way, that if you had darker skin, you were of less value. When it came to intellectual, when it came to the utility of you as a as a person, so much so that your value didn't even equate to a full personhood, right? 3/5 of a person. And it goes even into the gender too, because look, up until like early 1900s, women had no voice as well. So imagine then being trained up in this educational system where then they're becoming the teachers. What would we expect then them to teach that same systemic racist thoughts and not ever even acknowledge it? And so while I totally agree with both of you that I think it's great for young black and brown, Asian and African American and Hispanic, Latino and Latina, leaders to come up. I think we also, though, and maybe it's more on my end where the white pastors have to go into older white generations and say, dudes, here's an issue, right? But that's why we need to be doing this together, because how can I speak into my culture, even if it's diverse? Let's say I have a multitude of color at our church, right? But if we're all thinking the same, someone who came up in the mid 60s, even if they were black and they had a good sense and they were a Christian, they were taught for years that they did not equate and didn't have the same value, and so we need to continue, I think, to press into that communal learning so as to talk to each other. And then you can say to me, well, this is because like one of the posts I think that Metzger posted or was interacting with one of the guys from the USA Today, that crap maker, that even white is a color, and so to talk about people of color, we're talking about all humanity, but we have to understand in context, like you were saying, Tony, it's not that you're trying to bash every time on the white evangelicals, but there comes a point where the white evangelicals have to wake up and go, oh, wait, if we all are in this together, that must mean that, hey, there must be an acknowledgement on my behalf, but also then anyone who is black or brown, it's not always, hey, we're out just to bash the white evangelical pastors, and I don't think we've been willing to have these dialogues. COVID-19 is to where it's like, if you're a Christian, you should be pushing against wearing masks because God is on our side, right? And that mentality, though, was what was used in slave times to say God has equipped the white to be in leadership because of whether it's intellectual or position. And so that just continued to permeate. And unless we're having those discussions of saying, well, gosh, what did the generations push down? We're not going to break through this to where we recognize it's great that the three of us are getting here. And I think it's awesome that, like Phil, you're saying to Tony, hey, look, you're part of this movement. But if it's only within our generations, the generations of 40 and under and everything, and we're just talking about it, what does it do for the church? And how easy is it, though, to have these conversations at leadership when none of us are allowed to be a part of leadership? So I'm not even sure we have, and I think the church tries and the human tries to categorize what's worse. Is racism worse than ageism, which is worse than gender, discrimination? Or do we go like Jesus and said, dude, this is sin. Sin is sin. Okay. So that what Falwell did, that was absolutely unacceptable. Just as much as what Bill Hybels did, in having sex with his secretary. Yet we don't ever talk about that. Why? Because he's a bigwig from a church that you just don't touch, right? Willow Creek, Saddleback. We have this sort of beacons of these ivory towers of churches. No one is willing because, oh, we don't criticize one another. Jesus didn't say don't judge. He says, be careful with what standard you judge by and judge with righteous judgment. I'm not even sure that people are willing to have these conversations because we nitpick. Oh, if you start saying something about race, Phil, people come back and say, well, of course, look at you. You're black, and so you've got issues. You're just not seeing it's getting better. I've got a black friend who says it's better. I'm like, that's horseshit. Based on what? That's like Jesus in the first century, the one thief to the next thief saying, my crucifixion is a little bit better, you know. I mean, they didn't beat me as much as they beat that poor fella, you know. And I feel like that's what the church is doing today. It's like, oh, well, it's better. By whose standards?
I think as a millennial, uh, I will never claim the greatest generation moniker, because a different generation has already tried to go for that title. But I'll be the first to say, man, I believe in Zoomers more than any other generation. I believe in Generation Z. And so as a youth pastor, I really see myself as a forerunner. I really see so Matt, when you're talking about intergenerational ministry, and intergenerational collaboration, like, dude, Gen Z, they're already doing some things that we just need to get on board with, like as far as like their activism, as far as their, in some ways, rejection of consumerism. I mean, yes, they, in some ways they do swing really far on autonomy and individualism, but man, these kids and these young adults are not going to be duped into the power structures that a lot of us were duped. And so, yeah, I think when we look at intergenerational ministry, I'm more hopeful for the future than ever. I may be super young, but I'm ready to say, here are the keys. Because yeah, when we become calcified in our leadership and we hold on to positions of influence and power and authority, yeah, I think we consume, like, and then we become consumed by that power, and then we're all about protecting that prestige and position.
Yeah, and when it comes to the greatest generation, I always ask, great in what? My wife's grandfather, his brother stormed Normandy, you know, and we would sit down, and her grandfather, I would love to go in and talk with him. They, you know, I think I mentioned this before, they had happy hour at his house and everything. And would just go sit. And the one thing that he one time said to me that was so profound is that his brother was, when he came back, he was so angry because he felt like they were given a raw deal by being told that they were the greatest generation. Why? Because they're going to go fight to end the war, to end all wars. And then when months passed and continued to transition into the next, and we were still fighting with each other, he's like, dude, this is garbage, you know? And so for me, the greatest generation is going to be the one that's seen as the lowest of the lowest, right? We have become the scum of the world, right? How do you do that? You get into each other's lives, you know, you get into the mess of just who we are as people. You have to have dialogue to do that. This is what we're going to continue to uncork, this idea of the human and stepping into the mess of life, this beautiful mess that Jesus says that he came to give us abundantly. And so what does that mean? So on behalf of Tony and Phil, I'm Matt Farlow, and this is New Wine Uncorked. Join us again next week. Before you leave, though, again, on the other side of Phil right there, hit that subscribe button so that you'll be notified for all the videos that are coming up. And head on over to new-wineskins.org and see how you can join the new wine movement, because like Tony was saying, this is a movement into culture so as to transform culture. And you want to be a part of that. You don't need to be a part of any certain group, you know, that has a claim on it. We all have a claim on transformation together if we say yes to Jesus. That's what he came to do. So again, New Wine Uncorked. Until next video, look at YouTube for this posting. You'll see it on there. So till next week, I'm Matt, that's Tony, and that's Phil. We'll see you on the flip side.